and welcome to WCAT TV's I Thought You'd Like to Know. I'm Father Tom Davis. I'm the president of the Liberty Institute for Faith and Ethics, or LIFE. You can find that at libertyforlife.org. That's liberty, the numeral 4, life.org. And on Facebook. And I'm the pastor of St. Anne Melkite Catholic Church in Danbury, Connecticut. And I'm delighted to encourage you to register for a fascinating webinar on October 10th, brought to you by the Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology, or ITEST, that is rather provocatively entitled, Do You Want to Be Genetically Engineered? ITEST's mission is to demonstrate the complementarity of faith and science and their mutual objective, which is truth. And it promises to be a deep dive into that mission when they show their webinar, Do You Want to Be Genetically Engineered? And I have the privilege to introduce to you today one of the eminent authorities on the topic of science and the ethics of human genetic engineering, Father Kevin FitzGerald, S.J., which is the topic he will address at the webinar. But first, let me, in addition to introducing you to Father FitzGerald, tell you about two outstanding experts with unparalleled and unique experience related to the ethical, scientific, and I would even say the political issues associated with human gene editing. Richard Doerflinger is a public policy fellow at the University of Notre Dame's Center for Ethics and Culture and an adjunct fellow in bioethics and public policy at the National Catholic Bioethics Center in Philadelphia. And he will address human gene editing and human dignity in the webinar. Richard is eminently qualified for that. He's the former associate director of the Secretariat of Pro-Life Activities for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, where he worked for 36 years as really the legendary voice of the bishops in congressional testimony on matters from everything from abortion, euthanasia, conscience rights for healthcare workers, embryo research, and other medical and moral issues. He is a member of the Pontifical Academy for Life. He and Father FitzGerald will be joined by Tim Hunt. Tim will address clinical progress in gene editing and the government and institutional regulatory framework that is in place related to research and human treatment. Tim has more than 20 years experience in the biotech field and in the pharmacological industry. He served as chair of the American Society of Gene and Cell Therapy's Government Relations Committee. He's been a member of BIO's Human Genome Editing Working Group and the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine's Gene Editing Task Force. Now, let's get to the webinar on Father FitzGerald. To learn more about that, about do you want to be genetically engineered, and to whet your appetite a bit, let me introduce Father Kevin. So he is eminently qualified. His education and his background I'm going to briefly summarize because it gives you some idea of the quality of the webinar that's being offered by ITEST. Father Kevin is the John A. Crichton University professor and chair of the Department of Medical Humanities in the School of Medicine at Crichton University. He holds a Ph.D. in molecular genetics and a Ph.D. in bioethics from Georgetown. You know, I went to Fordham University, another Jesuit school up in the Bronx. My uncles, my daughter, so you know, Georgetown's our little sister down south. His research has included the investigation of abnormal gene expression in cancer, examination of ethical issues in biomedical research and medical genomics, among many other things. He has published many educational, scientific, and ethical articles in peer-reviewed journals, books, and in popular press, as well as his presentations on genetic engineering, cloning, stem cell research, and what's come to be known as personalized medicine, a fascinating term that I'm sure we'll have some opportunity to address today. He's also a founding member of Do No Harm, and a member of the Ethics Committee of March of Dimes, a member of the Genetic Alliance Institutional Review Board, and he is a corresponding member of the Pontifical Academy of Life since, I think, 2005, and a consultant of the Pontifical Council of Culture since 2014. Wow. So, Father, it's truly a blessing to have us with you today. So let me throw out a question, if I might. What's the answer? I mean, should I want to be genetically engineered? I mean, it sounds great, but I'm worried.
Well, you know, it's a great question, which is, I think, why we picked it for our webinar on October 10th. But the interesting thing about this is it's really not a new question. People think, wow, this is a fascinating new technology, and in a sense it is. But in another sense, we've been looking into this kind of idea for thousands of years. In fact, if you go back and you look at breeding techniques, both for plants and animals, they're thousands of years old, because even that long ago, people recognized that by selecting certain characteristics in the parents of the offspring that they were looking for, whether it's a plant or an animal, they could kind of start to push those characteristics in a particular direction. And in fact, you can go back and look in Plato's writings, and at one point he says, you know, you can try to select parents to increase the courageous characteristics of their offspring. But if you do that too consistently over too many generations, then you end up with children who are too crazy, too bold. They don't have enough sense not to do things. He said, but on the other hand, if you chose timidity as a characteristic, in the end, after several generations, you could end up with children who are just scared of everything and totally paralyzed. Now, Plato wrote this over 2,000 years ago. So it's not new in that sense. What's new is that the technology now allows us to do it without necessarily involving generation after generation after generation, although that could be the case, as we'll talk about later. But right now, what we've done is develop technologies that allow us to treat our own genetic material, so like all the genes and everything that's in your cells, all together, which is called your genome. We can try, at any rate, to edit your genome in a way similar to the way we edit in word processing programs, like WordPerfect in Microsoft Word. So when you go in and you say, here's a sentence I want to change, you look to where you want to make those edits in the sentence, and you might highlight something and remove it, or you might just add in some words, right? We're all familiar with that technology. Well, the interesting thing is the way we conceptualize our genes is letters of what we call nucleotides that form DNA. Those letters are A, C, G, and T, and they make up words. So it's very similar in that sense. And the idea would be that we can use these technologies to go in and edit those words. But there's a slight difference. Actually, it's not so slight when you really think about it. Right now, our genetic technology is not nearly as good as our software for word processing. It doesn't always get it right. So for instance, if you're doing a word search and you type in a particular word, you don't expect to see other words pop up, even if they're spelled similarly. Or if you type in a phrase, you don't expect to see other phrases to pop up. The problem currently with the genetic technology we have is, in spite of the fact that it's so much better than anything we've had before, mistakes are still made. Let me give you just an example. Say you had a sentence, and the sentence is, Saturday is, or Saturday is the day we want to target. So Saturday is the day we want to target, and you want to edit that sentence. And you wanted to now say, Saturday is no longer the day we want to target. Okay, you're just going to add no longer to that sentence. That would be a piece of cake for your software for word processing. For genetic engineering, might be a little more different. One problem would be, for instance, when you would do your search, the molecules you would send in to look for the genetic phrase that said, Saturday is the day we want to target. You might also identify Saturn is the planet we want to target. Well, that's interesting. that's very different, but it does start with the same letters and end with the same words. So there's enough overlap there that the targeting mechanism might actually identify that sentence as also a target for editing. And if it's successful, you would have your first gene, your target gene, Saturday is the day we wish to target, get edited properly. Saturday is no longer the day we wish to target. But also you might get that second sentence edited to Saturn is no longer the day we want to target, which could be a problem because the first change you make is a change you want to make. The second change you make is not. And that might be a very important gene that you need to function well. So that in spite of the fact that you're successful in your targeting of the gene you want to change, you might also do what we call an off-target effect and change something else. The big example of this that people still talk about is, you may remember David the Bubble Boy from back in the 1980s,
Sure.
Right? He had a disease, and that disease caused his immune system never to develop. So he couldn't fight off colds, scratches that were infected, anything. So he had to live in that bubble. They identified the genetic difference that caused his condition. And they thought, what if we could go in and edit that difference and change it back to what it was? Not even have to do that in all the cells. Just if we got enough of the cells in his bone marrow, we could potentially give him an immune system that would work. Now, it didn't work for David, but later, a couple decades later, they were able to try this experiment on some young children who had the same disease, and they were successful in one sense. So I think there were about 20 children in the original research clinical trial. About 15 or 16 were successfully treated to the extent where their immune systems actually started to function. Unfortunately, of those 15, because of the genetic engineering that was done, there were off-target effects. And 3 of those children came down with cancer and died. So that was a truly, in one sense, tragic situation, because here is something they were trying to do to give these children a much, much more normal and healthy life. And yet in doing so, 3 of them ended up dying. But it raised an incredible ethical challenge. What do you do when you have parents who have children with that condition where they have to live in a bubble? They can't interact with their parents and their siblings and friends in the same way other children do. And you have this technology that says, you know, we might have like a 75% chance of success in bringing back an active immune system. But if it is successful, then you have a 20% chance of dying of cancer. How do you make that balance?
That's I've seen presentation you've done, very fascinating one I recommend to people on YouTube about genetic engineering, in which you discuss the prevalence of human growth hormone deficiency of people down in Ecuador. And the idea, because you mentioned this word, parents want their children healthy and normal. What is healthy and normal? I think we'll get into that. And what are some consequences if you try to give people human growth hormone and have the receptors function, and then there's some other diseases that might develop. But when you mention the genetic engineering and genetic medicine, the other term that comes to mind, just introductory to all of this, I hear a lot about genomic medicine. And what is the difference, if there is a difference, between genetic medicine and genomic medicine and genomic health?
And a great question. And that's an important question, because in the beginning, you know, these words were used sort of interchangeably, but now we've become a bit more precise. Normally now, when you use the word genetic, you're talking more specifically about a particular gene, or perhaps a family of genes, so they're all related, or maybe even a series of genes that interact with one another. So it's the more narrow, specific, and focused use of the term. When you use the term genomic, What you're talking about is all the genetic information, all the genes, all the genetic information that isn't necessarily in genes, but helps regulate turning them on and off. And so that's the difference for people to try to put into place when they hear sort of genetic versus genomic. Genomic, you're talking more globally, like the entire person's genome, as we mentioned before. The reason that's important in terms of health is getting back to this question of how complex we are as an organism. So yes, could you go in and attempt a gene therapy, a treatment to edit a particular gene or change the expression of the gene, turning it on and off? Yes, maybe you can do that. But then the question is, what implications would that have, even if you are successful for the rest of the genome, for the rest of your complex genetic makeup? And it gets actually, unfortunately, but in many ways, not surprisingly, because we are, as we know, wondrously made. Not only now do we have to talk about that genetic sequence in the DNA, the A, C, Gs, and Ts, but we have to talk about how those get expressed, how they're turned on and off, because genes are not all on all the time. The way we know that is look at your body. You have different tissues that do different functions. You have different cells that do different things, and yet they all have the same genome in them. And the reason they do different things is for some cells, certain sets of genes are turned on. For other cells, other sets of genes are turned on. And that's how it works. That turning on and off part we now recognize is as important, if not more so, than the genetic sequence itself. So we call that epigenetics or epigenomics. So it's sort of what's above or beyond just the sequence, but what's regulating it turning on and off. And that too now becomes important, because you may be aware that there are certain treatments now in clinical trials where they're not necessarily trying to change the genetics of the patient or the participant in the trial, but just how that gene is turned on and off, or the way in which it's expressed. And when we mean expressed, that usually means you take the DNA sequence, you transcribe it, you make another copy of it, write a copy, and then that gets translated into proteins. And the proteins, of course, are the functional things in our cells that help make them work. So the idea here is you don't necessarily need to go in and change the gene itself if you can intervene in the process of changing that gene into a protein. So there's all kinds of ways to get at it.
One of the things that makes it accessible or inaccessible for many people is the vocabulary. And you helped quite a bit with that. And you mentioned epigenetics, epigenomics, and you mentioned transcription. I imagine it must be epitranscription.
There's transcriptomics, as a matter of fact.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So people can Google those and learn a lot about those. There's tons of material out there, and it's very interesting because some of the information is presented straight and some presented in conjunction with a point of view about how to use things. But you gave an example a little bit ago about the bubble boy and that particular thing. We talked just briefly, we touched on this condition people have with the human growth hormone down in Ecuador. And I've read about non-human examples of genetic and food crops, photosynthesis toying, editing insects so they won't be able to transmit a disease. Wonderful concepts, right? Wonderful stuff. But we're really interested, and you're going to be in this webinar, interested in how this applies to human beings and to the human person. So can you give us a couple of examples, perhaps, about how where that is? What are people talking about as particular targeted treatments or objectives?
And it's great that you bring that up. And in fact, it's a very interesting question because, again, think of it this way. So you're writing a document, and in your document, you want to make one edit. Okay, that's fairly straightforward and easy. But let's say now someone comes to you and says, well, wait a minute, you talk about this in this particular way all throughout your document, and really you don't want to do that. You want to now change it and talk about it in a different way. That would be a more complex edit. So when you're talking about diseases, the question often comes up, would this disease be effectively treated by just making one particular type of edit? In other words, it's just one gene involved in creating this disease. So we can think of like the disease created for David the Bubble Boy. That was from a particular gene, one genetic difference. We can talk about sickle cell anemia, which is an area where they're doing clinical trials right now. Again, a particular genetic edit. But those are not the major diseases that the world is struggling with right now. The major diseases would be things like type 2 diabetes and cancer and congestive heart failure and neurological diseases, all of which involve many different genes, many different factors. So then the question becomes, how do we get this technology, these therapies started? And of course, like with many things, you start with, the easier targets where a single gene edit can have a significant impact on the burden of the disease. And so that's why you hear often about the diseases that are being targeted right now. And that's where Tim Hunt is absolutely expert, because he's involved in the biotech and the pharma industry. And he'll talk about a couple of projects that are underway. But if you go to a website called clinicaltrials.gov, that's where all clinical trials have to be registered in the United States, you can type in gene therapy and see the dozens of different treatments that are underway. Again, one that is being pursued right now, which is fascinating, is sickle cell anemia, which is called by a single change, one letter change in a gene that's very much involved in your red blood cell function. And that leads to the sickle cell and the anemia. And the issue there is, again, since it is in the bloodstream, you wouldn't necessarily have to fix all the red blood cells. You've got to just fix a certain percentage. So that would be a seeming target where you have both the advantage of it's a single edit change and you don't have to get them all. By changing some, you'll actually decrease the burden of the disease. Wow. So that's one that's why that's in fact one of the targets right now.
Yeah, and I just I won't go off on a crazy digression, but what immediately jumps to mind for me, I'm a lawyer as well as a priest, is that you can just see immediately the eruption of fights over who's going to get the funding. The person who wants the single cell treatment that's focused, that has a real life chance of bringing us something quickly, or someone who wants that money on a more long-term, more complicated kind of, and I'm sure the research battles over the funding are epic.
As always, right? There's never enough, and you have to make choices, right?
That's right, and that leads me to another question about some of things that seem to concern people with this capacity as it develops, and it seems inevitable it's going to develop by leaps and bounds monthly, just constantly changing, that there's going to be questions of eugenics are going to arise. Questions about who gets it and what is it we really want to do. And maybe you could offer some comments about that, because I know you've spoken quite movingly and written quite movingly about that.
Well, it gets back to, remember, when I was talking about doing breeding techniques, why were these people thousands of years ago using breeding techniques? Because they recognized that they could take these plants and animals and push them in a direction that would be more useful to us, right? Would be better for us. And who decided what was better for us? Oh, by the way, we did, right? So the farmers and the animal husbandry people who were making these decisions, were saying, I need an animal that can withstand winter better, right? Because I'm in a cold climate. Whereas another breeder might say, I need an animal that produces more wool, right? Because, yeah, we're in a warmer climate, but because we're warmer, they're not producing as much wool. So That was all determined by who was doing the breeding and the needs that they had. Now, when you try to translate that to human beings, right, that raises some serious ethical issues. Who's better? And who decides who's better? And what is better? So back to that group in Ecuador, and I do reference them a lot because they, in one sense, have a very serious genetic condition. It's called Laurent Syndrome, L-A-R-O-N, named after the scientist who discovered it. And because of their genetic mutation, which is again a specific mutation in a specific gene, the human growth hormone receptor, because of that, they don't grow to normal height. In fact, they're very short. But that same genetic change also makes it so they never die of cancer and they never get type 2 diabetes. Now, are they sick or are they what human beings should be? Because the rest of us have to go through life worrying about type 2 diabetes and cancer. And should we genetically engineer everybody to have Laurent syndrome? Now, interesting, when you talk to people about this, and I've done this for many, many, many different classes of medical students and also just different groups that come to hear talks, I'll say, how many of you would like me to genetically engineer your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren, because this gets passed down, to have Laurent syndrome, so that they'll never get cancer and they'll never get type 2 diabetes. They'll also never be over 4.5 feet tall. And people inevitably say, no. And you have to ask the question, why? Don't we want to cure cancer and type 2 diabetes? Well, our concepts of health are as complex, if not more so, than our biological organism. And fascinatingly, for many cultures, in many places in the world, tall is better. Right? We just have all kinds of empirical evidence for that. So is it wrong, unhealthy to be short? And that's a fascinating question in many different ways. And again, that gets back to what you were talking about before with the hormone treatments that are legal here in the United States. And from your legal background, now there's a fascinating question, right? Is it a good thing to treat these children who are going to be projected to be short? I mean, maybe 5 foot or shorter for girls and 5'3" or shorter for boys. Treat them as children so that they might be a few inches taller, but at the same time, you might be increasing their risk of developing type 2 diabetes or maybe even cancer. How do parents make that decision? And how do we guide them in making that decision, especially in a culture where it's clear taller is favored? And again, fascinating things that the genetic technologies are now just making even all the more important.
Right, right. So this whole question of what do we want to cure or what do we want to normalize has reached really startling proportions in places like Denmark, right, with Down syndrome. And they virtually eliminated it from their society among newborns. And you might hear from time to time someone say, I've heard this, oh, we were blessed in that pregnancy we discovered early on and we were able to avoid that. Avoid, that becomes a term. Okay, well, so that brings up a big question in my mind about an area of genetic testing, right, as opposed to actual treatments, especially prenatal. So prenatal testing has been for years and years been amniocentesis. Everyone knows there's a risk. And now we see developing other techniques that are risk-free to the developing child, to the fetus, because they draw blood from mom and they find free-floating DNA in the blood, and some of that's fetal, and they make estimates based on that. Can you talk a little bit, how is that going to impact this eugenic question?
Yeah, so that's a great point. And what you're talking about is non-invasive prenatal testing, or NIPT. And the advance there, as you mentioned, is it used to be in order to get genetic material that related to the developing fetus, you had to basically be invasive into the mother's womb and either pull fluid out from the amniotic sac surrounding the fetus and look for cells in that fluid, or sample the placenta and pull cells from that, which is called chorionic villi sampling, both of which have low level, but A level, 1-2%, depending upon who's doing, can be more depending on who's doing the sampling, of causing a loss of the pregnancy. Now we have moved to a technology where you can just sample the mother's blood, and we've discovered, again, you know, the fascinating things we find out about ourselves. We've discovered that during pregnancy, there are fetal cells circulating in the mother's blood. And in fact, you can find cells from the various children the mother has carried years after they've been born.
No way.
Still in their bloodstream. Yes, still circulating. It's unbelievable. It's amazing. But that's there. Because of that, then, you can pull the cells out, identify the ones that are the fetal cells because they're genetically different than mom, right? Because it's mom and dad, and look at that genetic sequence to see what may be different about it. Now, here's where we get into the whole eugenics thing, right? What's different and what's a disease. And so, yes, the Down syndrome community is one now that is facing this issue of what would happen if there were a genetic intervention that could become. We know the cause of Down syndrome, right? You have an extra chromosome 21. We've also identified the genes on that chromosome, which are likely related to the characteristics that come along with Down syndrome. And so the question is, could we go in genetically or epigenetically and adjust that to make Down syndrome people more like the rest of us? Which is a fascinating question in terms of, well, who's the rest of us? And what does that mean? And what's the goal? Right? Because from a population genetics perspective, one thing that we always do when we talk about the health of a species is to ask how diverse the species is. And of course, one of the flawed scientific premises of eugenics, the eugenics movement in the United States and in Nazi Germany and other places, that, by the way, the Catholic Church railed against, scientifically said this is not accurate, was that somehow you could pick a human type and that would be the type that everybody would want to be. Now, from a population genetics perspective, that would be crazy because you'd be setting up the species for extinction. And yet there were some very bright scientists who were all behind this because they thought that there was a way that they could somehow envision what that perfect human species would look like. And of course, we know that in a sense, our perfection is in our diversity. Another way we can look at this is to say, what characteristics about ourselves do we hold most dear? Is it to be the most intelligent person on the face of the earth or the most loving and accepting person on the face of the earth? And for people who have members of their family who have Down syndrome, who have worked with people with Down syndrome, who know people with Down syndrome, they can be some of the most loving, accepting people on the face of the earth.
Absolutely.
And so why are we saying no to that? Now, granted, there are other, cardiac conditions and other things that go along with that, but the question always comes back to, what's the goal here? What do we mean by being healthier? And who gets to decide that?
Yeah. So when you mention this idea of why do we want to deal with a particular thing and make this judgment, I can't help but think of that great Catholic writer Flannery O'Connor, and an amazing introduction to the memoir of Mary Ann that she wrote back, I guess, in the 50s, about a young girl who was cared for by the Hawthorne sisters in a cancer hospital down in the Atlanta area. It's a fascinating thing. It's online all over the place. People should Google it and read it. But she says the reason for this is because people can't stand having to look at imperfection, what they perceive as imperfection. So they're interested in their shock and their suffering. They want to get rid of it. It's a fascinating discussion of ethics and morals. You mentioned this non-invasive prenatal testing, and I'm wondering, how about what does this hold potential for terms of projecting the course of someone's life decades down the road? How can we foresee a time when we can anticipate being able to tell you, you're going to get cancer at such a date, this kind of cancer, this particular malady is going to arise for you, and sort of tell you when it's likely to arise? And just think of the policy implications for that.
Oh yeah, and you know, again, you bring up an excellent point. And again, there is a genetic condition that addresses that directly, and it's called Huntington's chorea. And most people have heard of Huntington's chorea. Not too many people have maybe know anybody with it because it's a relatively rare disease. But it's a disease that, again, through our genetic research, we've been able to identify the mutation that causes the disease. And it's an interesting mutation in terms that there are times when those letters in your DNA repeat a particular word or phrase. So in genetics, words are spelled with 3 letters. And if you get those 3 letters repeated over and over and over and over again, maybe a dozen times or 2 dozen or 3 or 40 times, then that's called, you know, a repeat sequence that presumably has some reason for existence. Otherwise, it wouldn't be there. In the Huntington's chorea, that repeat sequence is part of the protein that is made. So the protein is made of amino acids, and a particular amino acid is repeated. Well, what happens if that repeated sequence suddenly doubles or triples in length? It makes the protein different. It has a different shape to it, a different structure, and a different function, which is less than it would normally. So by looking at the number of repeats, geneticists now can actually predict for people who have that mutation about what time in their life the disease will start to manifest itself. Now, that is fascinating, and it affects a small number of people. Now, however, as you mentioned, we're getting a much better idea of how cancer comes about, and also Alzheimer's. And so there are algorithms, let's put it that way, that can be used right now that measure a variety of different features in a person that are now being employed to say, we can take students in their 20s, look at them, and predict at what point in their life they might start to manifest symptoms of Alzheimer's. So what are we going to talk? You talk about your legal and your policy issues. What are you going to do with that one? Yeah.
What are you going to do? I mean, health insurance coverage.
There
was a proposal a number of years ago, back in the very late 70s, early 80s, by a bioethicist. It was in the New York Times, in which he proposed that persons who did not sign advanced medical directives, and he meant living wills to stop care at a certain point, should not be eligible for Medicare and Medicaid. Nobody really is going, at that time, was thinking of ever adopting something like that. But you know, there are only X number of dollars, and there are X number of needs, and they don't match.
Right.
So the pressure is huge, especially at the political level, to find a solution to that. And that really brings us, that's a little different, end of life decisions. It's not quite the same thing, but it is a eugenic question in a sense. By the way, I just wanted to mention, I don't know if others, you've just seen, but I'd encourage others to look. The Congregation for Doctrine of the Faith just published an incredibly fine letter. The prefix is very precise. No, the Jesuit, I'm sure you're very proud of that fact. He's quite excellent on healthcare, especially in the terminal condition, both of adults, others, and infants and children. Beautifully profound, very, very clear. But that's just one example. We talked a bit about the eugenic question, and I know that in the law point of view, everybody knows about a case called Buck versus Bell, about a young lady back in the 20s and 30s, and she was sterilized involuntarily when the Supreme Court upheld the right to sterilize people based on these very bad science, that because she had a child out of wedlock and the child's head was not quite normal and her mother was a prostitute, she held characteristics likely to manifest through time and generations to go, and so sterilize her. An 8-to-1 vote of the Supreme Court, the only dissenting vote, the only Catholic on the court at the time, who didn't actually write an opinion for why. In those days, you didn't tell why, you just dissented. But that, I want to get back to that eugenic question. What exactly is meant? We talked, when I introduced you in the webinar, I talked about something called personalized medicine. It's a strange phrase because I always thought I was getting personalized medicine. And now I want to go back to talk to Dr. Joe. What the heck have you been doing with me? But if personalized medicine means my well-being, what is well-being? And who's going to make that decision? Isn't who makes the decision underneath all of this?
And of course, and what framework of concepts is that person who makes that decision employing to make that decision, either consciously or unconsciously? So again, going back to that Supreme Court decision, it would be fascinating to be able to go back today with the information we have now and be able to say, would you still think the same? And what made you think the way you did? Because again, as I mentioned, there were some very famous people. H.J. Muller was a famous geneticist back in the 20s and 30s. And he was absolutely convinced, that this was the way to go. We were obligated to improve our species in this way. Then along came Theodosius Dobzhansky in the 60s, who looked at it from a more population perspective and said, wait a minute, this is all off. Again, from a scientific understanding. Now, why can you have two very smart scientists who are at the cutting edge of their field coming to very, very different conclusions? We have that today. Talk to scientists in the United States who do plant genetic engineering, and talk to scientists in Europe with the same PhDs in plant genetics, and get their perspective on genetically modified foods. You get in a room with the two of them and they're both calling each other idiots, and yet they have the same degrees from the same institutions. So what's going on? What's going on is there's obviously more things that are impacting the way that we interpret this scientific information, right? And then assess another person's health, exactly as you said, right? We put our framework, and so it makes me uncomfortable to engage with this person who looks different, who acts differently, who has challenges different than my own. And yet at the same time, if you, again, and I always like to do this with sort of like junior high, high school groups or whatever, and say to them, would you like to be 7 feet tall? And junior high boys, inevitably, oh yeah, I want to be 7 feet. I want to play in the NBA. I want to do all that. Do you know that being that tall gives you a significantly higher chance of having a shorter lifespan just because you're that tall? Now, does that stop them from saying that? Of course not. I still want to play in the NBA. All right, I want to be a big star. All right. So obviously, our concepts of health are much, much more complex than just our mere physiological functioning. And that's the real challenge that is going to come up with this genetic technology, because it's going to allow us to do things that even breeding would not allow. And so the question again will be, what's the goal? And this is where I think the Catholic Church, as it did in the eugenics movements, can again make a contribution and say, if we look at all human beings as gifts from God, right, as unique contributors to the human species, regardless of how long they live, regardless of how smart they are, regardless of any of those characteristics, just by being a member of our human family. They are a gift. Then it changes the dynamic dramatically. It takes
Yes.
away, I think, a lot of those policy tensions because you're no longer having to decide who makes it and who doesn't.
And that whole framework is driven at its foundation, is it not, by your view of what it means to be a person. And you either have seems to me that you either have an idea that a person has a transcendent destiny, or they're just a collection of matter for some temporary consciousness that will vanish. And that really is underneath that debate. So, and certainly that's the debate with the scientists, right? A lot of them are, what the heck is an animal? Who cares? It's just some stuff. And that goes even further. Some people are proposing definitions of person that exclude even born individuals, but don't have the capacity for meaningful self-reflection, for instance. I think of the professor at Princeton, I'm not remembering his name right now, Singer.
Yeah, Peter Singer.
Peter Singer.
Yeah.
Well, some very challenging idea, very bold presentation, and he's true to his foundations.
Not always. He was the one who was saying, no, you get to a certain age and then that's that, or if you're not, no one should make more than $30,000 a year. Did you check his salary recently?
No, I haven't.
The other one was they discovered that he was paying for his mother to live in a nursing home. And they said, I thought you said that shouldn't happen. He goes, well, it's different when it's your mother.
Yeah, different when it's your mother.
Yeah, well, of course it is. It's different when it's anybody's mother. Yeah.
Just this whole movement of trying to identify this. I found this fascinating reference in the American Journal of Psychiatry, of all places, reputable, highly respected, but in 1942.
Yeah.
Before the Nazi experiments became so widely known, at a time when the eugenic movement was at its zenith, really, right? Foster Kennedy, well-known eugenicist, advocated that it was a parent's and guardian's duty, after review by an institutional review board, of course, to be merciful to defective children who are tortured, convulsed, grotesque, absurd, useless, foolish, undesirable, and end their agony of living. The editorial board of the Journal of American Psychiatry endorsed it in their editorial on the same issue. It was a very widespread concept, and it really hasn't gone away. It's quite prevalent. And I think even people with great sincere good faith, deep believers in a transcendent future for us, they also share, and rightly so. Who doesn't want to cure a cancer, or who doesn't want to cure Alzheimer's? I mean, but as these things develop, and cures and techniques ameliorate or eliminate the condition, does that have the paradoxical effect of driving the eugenic movement even more aggressively to the forefront?
Well, and that, again, fascinating point, because in the past, one of the features of these movements were that they were considered to be so important as to be socially mandated. Nowadays, you don't see too many people pushing for something that extreme, but the way it's kind of captured today is to say, well, parents or other individuals have the right to decide for their children, because again, that's what the parent role is, if this is too much or they should be different or whatever. And therefore, based on parental autonomy or individual autonomy, people should be able to make their own decisions. Well, it's a fascinating, it's a very prevalent, very powerful argument, but it also has fascinating logical consequences, many of which I think we're experiencing now in our society today. But other societies have already started to experience some dramatic social consequences to the implementation of that perspective in terms of genetics, prenatal genetic testing. So you now have India, China, and South Korea who have had to pass laws to say that you can no longer use prenatal testing to do sex selection. Why? Because in some parts of their country, they have 130 males for every 100 females. And what does that do to our societies? What does that social imbalance do? So that, was something that was never brought up in terms of saying, oh no, this autonomy thing can't be what's the dominant perspective because you might have bad social consequences. Well, no, there they are. It's there. And it's not new either, right? The whole point is we have to learn to live with each other and appreciate one another's gifts. It can't just be, I get to decide in isolation.
Yeah. So it's fascinating. What's the effect of 130 males for 100 females? I mean, you're going to have assuming men and women pairing together in cohabitation or marriage of some kind. It continues to be the vast norm of humanity. I think that's likely, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
You're going to have a significant population that doesn't have that happening, and it's going to be young men. And young men circulate a lot of testosterone, don't they? And if you only have to observe them, anecdotally for a little while to realize that when young men don't get civilized, and perhaps that's part of what happens in marriage and family life to some extent, some have expressed the concern that this leads to an increase in the violence and the aggressiveness culture in the society.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's outside my area of expertise. But one thing I do know happens is in China, for instance, you have a lot of young men that can't find young women because there just aren't enough of them. So what do? They do what you would. They look elsewhere. So they bring in women from other countries. Okay. And of course, that raises all kinds of interesting social questions also. Where are they coming from? How are they getting in there? What sort of ways are they encouraging them to come in? And, how does that affect society? But again, similarly, we could do a thought experiment, again, sort of eugenic kind of thing, and say, all right, here's another thing we know. Certain people seem to be more resistant to the ravages of PTSD than others. The military was very interested in this for a while because they thought, wow, we can genetically test people. We'll find the people who are more resistant to the causes of PTSD, so they don't get it as much. We'll put those people out into the field, and then the other people who are more susceptible and sensitive, we'll keep back. Well, that's going to work well in the military. Yeah, I mean, it's like, so, but that was the thought. Now, we look around the world, we see all the tragedy that's going on. And I am not a psychologist or psychiatrist, but I can pretty much guarantee you there's going to be a lot of PTSD out there that we're going to be dealing with among people around the world, just because of all the incredible things that are happening, not just in terms of human on human violence, but drought, forced migration, all kinds of other things that are occurring. The fires in California, all of those things can trigger these sorts. So how are we going to do that in the future? Should we just say, well, let's just get rid of the people who are more susceptible because they're just not going to be able to handle this well? What will that do to society?
And there are some proposals I hear, I can't recall the names of the individuals, but to engage in a genetic re-engineering of the planet to address some of these questions. Genetically re-engineer the climate, what plants grow, what kind of vegetation is available, what animals can survive. So the genetic question is huge. I mean, it's just, I don't know how to put boundaries around it. And, but this has been fascinating and very helpful. If I could just ask one last question.
Sure.
If this helps us to sort of bookend this discussion. There is you mentioned this history of the Catholic Church in responding to eugenics movements. In the last decade and so, the Catholic Church has released some very fascinating reflections, Dignitas Personae, for instance, on various bioethical questions, and the genetic question becomes one of them. Do you see this primacy of the human life, the primacy of the human person, which seems to be the foundation of the church's approach to this? Is there further developments we might anticipate on that? Or is it simply that concept is going to be at odds with a developing secular concept, and a clash has to produce some resolution?
So that, again, great question. And I would say it could go either way. I think we can make the choice. I certainly know within the church, we are working on how best to integrate these technologies into fostering fulfilling lives for each and every human being. It's not that the technology is intrinsically bad. It isn't. It's amazing technology. It's incredible. The question is to what ends you use it, and to what criteria you use to say whether something's good or bad. So if, again, one takes the fundamental stance to say each and every human being is a gift, and we want to treasure that gift as much as possible, then the question comes down to, okay, how do we judge what the risks of this particular genetic intervention might be versus what the potential benefits might be? Not in terms of doing something to, in any way, shape, or form, diminish the humanness of that person, but in fact to foster that. So you always have that sort of side of it that you can use to bracket whatever it is you decide to do. Is this really a fulfilling move for this person? Is this actually increasing the humanness of that person? And in fact, one of the ways in which we struggle with this is at the end of life, because we have a lot of technologies we can throw at things. Those throwing the technologies is not always the most humane thing to do. We don't want to kill anyone intentionally. We don't want to torture anyone intentionally either, just to try to keep a particular organ functioning more. So always we want to look at the concept of health in its holistic, comprehensive perspective, which of course includes our human relationality, our ability to be there for one another. And if someone can't be there for us, it doesn't mean we cannot be there for them.
Right, right. Excellent point. So, you know, the late great John Paul II wrote in his first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis, he wrote that the development of technology and the development of contemporary civilization, which is marked by the ascendancy of technology, demand a proportional development in morals and ethics. And this is really what iTest and this webinar is going to address in a specific application. Really fascinating. Do you want to be genetically engineered? So I guess the answer to that question is yes and no.
Yeah, exactly.
I want it, one where it does me good. I don't want it where it scares the heck out of me. And I guess I don't want my genetic footprint publicized to the world. So a lot of privacy questions as well. Father Kevin FitzGerald, thank you so much for your time today. I'm looking forward to joining that webinar on October 10. Those interested can go to the website for iTest. It's the Institute for Technological Encounter with Science and Technology. You'll see a menu of events. And if you click on that menu, the very first thing you'll see is, do you want to be genetically engineered? So go, join a fascinating discussion with eminent experts and begin to ponder the question. Do you want to be genetically engineered? Do you want your generations to come to be genetically engineered? Thank you, Father. God bless you.
Thank you, Father Tom. Great to be with you.